Hello, welcome to the 11th episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This episode, we are going to be talking about the 1985 film, The Return of the Living Dead. I could not be more excited.
Yeah.
I feel like my whole life has been leading up to this episode.
Yeah, I remember early on when we first started talking about this, and it might even be on one of the early episodes of the podcast, I just glibly said, this movie sucks. And I watched it again, and I see why I thought it sucked when I was a little kid. And I have to completely revise that opinion now because it's fucking great.
Awesome. We'll get into it further a little later. Firstly, the next episode we're going to be getting into is Phantasm, which I think is going to be the low point of the Scary Thoughts episodes.
This was the most frequently requested by listeners movie for us to cover. And I've seen it a few times. I've seen the sequel. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen the new fourth one, which the fourth in the series, which I understand is not really necessary for anyone to watch. But it is definitely a movie that a lot of people remember and love. And it, I think you can always tell a film has a lot of enthusiasm behind it based on the quality of its merchandise. And this last year, they came out with Phantasm Ball ornaments for Christmas trees. And to me, that just puts this film on the map as far as being a truly beloved horror film.
I'm very prepared to knock it back down as best I can. But for this episode, I'll just leave that there. For this episode, spoiler alert, we are just going to be talking about this film as if you've seen it, because if you're listening to this podcast, you have seen Return of the Living Dead.
Yeah, and just because we'll probably talk about it, you should probably have seen Night of the Living Dead as well.
Well, everybody should have seen that movie for so many reasons.
And Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead. So even though that's not what this is about, there may be some spoilers. Spoiler alert, people get eaten by zombies. Almost everybody dies in all of these films. So
yeah, there's not much to spoil there, really.
Not really.
Everybody dies.
Yeah.
It's kind of just what happens in all of these films.
Yeah. Also, don't forget to go over to iTunes or Stitcher or whatever you happen to be listening to this on, some sort of weird, crazy crypto-anarchist device, perhaps, and give us a 5-star rating. We just got to 50 5-star ratings on iTunes, which is pretty damn good.
Golly.
Yeah, pretty cool. A lot of really thoughtful comments there, too, which is pretty nice considering how irritating it is to leave reviews on podcasts with the iTunes app. I commend all of you who've done it. Thank you so much. In about a week or two, I'm going to be on another podcast called Popcorn, Piss, and Vinegar, which is some of my buddies from back home in New Orleans. And they're just great people. They have a really fun kind of ESPN Sports Center take on all these genre films.
I like the rhythm that they have.
Yeah. And they just crank episodes too, which is pretty cool. Also, head on over to Instagram and check out @scarythoughts.podcast. There's some really fun inspirational messaging along with some cool horror images. It's been a little slow lately. Our intern has been on vacation, as millennials are wont to do. So hopefully she'll get back on that.
And before we start talking about Return of the Living Dead, I just want to put this out there. Whoever borrowed my DVD copy of this movie, I'm so glad you've had it for this long, but I really want it back. I have no idea where it went. I actually had to spend more money to rewatch this to prepare for this episode, despite the fact that I've been obsessed with this movie all this time. I ended up spending yet even more money on it. Shame on you. Where do we start?
Yeah, well, since this is your favorite movie,
yeah,
why don't you tell me about
one of?
Well, I mean, when did you see this movie? What kind of effect did it make on you when you saw it?
I saw this the day it came out at noon. There was no possible way for me to have seen this movie any sooner than the public was allowed.
Okay, and why were you
And
so
it was
jazzed?
me and one friend. It was just the two of us, best seats in the house. What's that?
Why were you so jazzed to see it? I mean, was there an ad campaign for it you saw, or did you enter it through the soundtrack? Because I know there were a lot of great bands on the soundtrack.
There were a lot of great bands on the soundtrack. I don't think I was aware of The Damned, The Cramps, all those bands when this movie came out. But I was really into punk. I don't know that I could call myself a punk at that time, but I was really into a certain sort of aesthetics of rebellion. And probably what happened is I probably saw Repo Man, loved it, and this was a Repo Man cranked up a notch
Yep.
in my eyes. And, you know, the previews were amazing. The movie posters, like, there was nothing like this shit, you know? Yeah, so, I mean, I saw it and then, like, immediately bought the soundtrack and had the T-shirt of the logo and, you know, ended up exposing me to a lot of amazing bands.
And had you seen Night of the Living Dead before this?
No.
No.
And in fact, I mean, we covered this in the episode where we were talking about, you know, our relationships to horror in episode 10, but I was not really a horror film kid. And I feel like almost everybody who's really, really into horror in their adult lives were like always into it. I wasn't. I had crazy nightmares when I was a kid. I was just not into horror movies, but this was special for me. This was different because of the sort of subcultural aspect of it.
Yeah, well, I know I must have rented this movie from there was a little movie theater place, and I talked about this in episode 10 as well. But there was not a movie theater, but a movie rental place by my house when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and I went in there with my mom, and she told the people who owned it, he can rent anything in here that he wants, and so for a little time I was renting like 2 or 3 horror movies a day over the summer, and so I remember just watching this when I had rented like 2 or 3 zombie movies, and this one was my least favorite of all of them, although I was highly impressed with the naked dance scene, which good. To me was like the first time I'd ever seen like a naked punk rocker girl, or, you know, but it was also just so absurd that it sort of remains non-sexy, even though it is incredibly alluring. It almost at the level of Saxophone Man and Lost Boys, except for way better. And then I also wasn't turned on to the music or thought it was anything exceptional. Although later on, when I did listen to like bands like the Circle Jerks and DRI, I recognized that vibe and what like punk rock meant because of this movie. So this movie, maybe Star Trek 4. Probably there's a punk rocker in Star Trek 4.
There is?
So, yeah. Like Spock puts him out on the bus there in San Francisco. Yeah. So
which is like the equivalent of the Terminator, give me your clothes now.
Yeah, kind of. And like he takes that dude. But like punk rockers in all these movies were always these kind of like, I almost thought of them as greasers, really. Like, because they served the same role as greasers did in like a 50s movie. They were just these random juvenile delinquents that just sort of looked like whatever happened to be the look at the time. And so
I guess for me, the Return of the Living Dead is in certain ways in line with like a John Hughes movie. I'm sort of overplaying this idea, but it's not that the punks in it were like so real, but they had a humanity, and they were not all just stereotypes. What I really appreciated is that, like, even though there are a lot of characters in this movie and there's no protagonist, yet like we get these little snippets of all these people,
which I love in movies. I love ensemble cast movies better than star-driven movies.
This movie, The Nazi, is protective of Tina, right? Suicide is like, show some respect for the dead. And you're kind of like, yeah, Trash, show some fucking respect. Or like Trash's death, even though it's ironic, is like, it's really terrifying. It's really fucked up. Like all these characters aren't just reduced to stereotypes. They all have 2 dimensions. And getting to see punks that actually were not just cardboard cutouts. However, of course, it is a comedy. It is a horror movie. They're not that deep. But they weren't like the Quincy Punk episode or the Chips Punk episode, where it's just a bunch of punks written by people who know nothing about this. And so it does overlap with like Amy Heckerling or John Hughes, where it's like, oh, kids that actually seem like real people to a degree.
Yeah, I actually had in my notes, these are Riverdale punks. And it made me think of like, because there's like these weird, as was common with some of the subculture stuff in the 80s, there are these like 50s elements. So you have the one kid who's like purposely square looking in the group, and then there's the other girl with kind of the Paula Abdul blue dress, which is this whole like almost like a sock hop dress. And then, you know, Suicide, the dude with the all leather, he's basically like a biker, and then they're rolling around in this great 1950s Cadillac convertible, which has my favorite graffiti ever, which is "Why Bother?" on the side of it. That shit is just so funny to me. And then also the sets of these films. I mean, we could talk about the You Need Medical Supply place in a little bit, but there's just that Hollywood graffiti on everything that's clearly all done in the same handwriting. They had like some intern just go around and just do all of it. Yeah. And then even in the You Need Medical Supply, almost everything in the building is labeled. So there'll be a box and it'll say like scalpels. Yes. It looks like somebody's just moved in, and it's all the same handwriting. And there's all these really fun, I kept looking to see if there was like hidden messages and stuff in them. And there are quite a few. And one of my favorite ones is it looks like an eye chart. Yeah. And it just says Bert is a slave driver, which is like the guy who owns the place. Yeah. And I think that all those little touches really do add to the humanity of these characters. And there is a lot of character development in a movie that certainly would not have been worse for not having it. I mean, right. It is really kind of like surprising, like, or just the weird stuff. Like, why is this guy maybe a Nazi in the embalmer? He has a Luger pistol and he just looks off and says some shit in German.
And he's got a photo of Eva Braun on his wall.
Right. So there's that.
Hilarious.
And yeah, there's that sort of thing. And then the whole, like, is he a secret Nazi thing was in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The original one, Dr. Scott maybe was a Nazi rocket scientist. So I was trying to think about if there are other movies where somebody may or may not have been a Nazi, but in the Monster Squad, the older man that sort of tells the younger kids like what's what, he is a concentration camp survivor. So he has the numbers tattooed on his arm, and they don't make any reference to it except for they say something like, oh, do you really believe in monsters? And he's like, yes, I do. And then you see the numbers on his arm. So there definitely is this post-World War II tension in a lot of these early 80s movies with these players that maybe were part of something horrible in the past.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I don't think that means anything to the film or to horror in general, except to maybe provide weird motivations for certain characters. But in this case, I mean, he's just like a badass, really. I mean, he kind of like is the most action oriented of all the characters.
Yeah. He pulls a gun.
Yeah.
I feel like Spider's pretty action oriented. Like, I feel like Spider is maybe I'm jumping ahead, but he's often the voice of reason. Mm-hmm. So I think there are two really interesting things that Return of the Living Dead introduced to not just zombies, but horror films in general. Mm-hmm. Maybe introduced is too strong a word, but the running zombie, which does change everything.
Right.
It's easy to overstate that, but I think it's, we shouldn't overlook what the difference between an ambling zombie and a running zombie is.
Yeah.
Not just in terms of how threatening they are, but how much they resemble us. When we talk about zombies and what the threat really is, it's about their proximity to who we really are and who we really view as a threat, which is other people. And if they run, they're a threat like other people are. And the other thing is that the half woman on the table who's talking to them, and they're interrogating her about, why do you eat brains? And they're basically getting this look into the afterlife. Mm-hmm. But it's Spider who's like, hey guys, fuck this. They have these questions about life after death, and there's, zombies are trying to break in, and it's Spider who's just like, no, fuck this. So he's kind of the pragmatic voice,
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, like, there's all these conversations about, like, fast zombie versus slow zombie, and it really does, more than anything else, affect the tension and the pace of the movie.
Yes.
Because when there's slow zombies, it's almost as if the humans who are living have more time to turn on each other. And so those dynamics become forward. And when they're fast zombies, it becomes more about survival. So it becomes more like there's an animalistic, like, chase vibe to it. Yep. And this is for sure the first important, these scare quote important zombie movie where everything moved fast. It's also the first movie, not counting Bub from Dawn of the Dead, that the zombies can talk.
Yes.
They clearly order in more paramedics, more cops, and then Tarman, who is the zombie that escapes out of the bucket or out of the army containment canister, he uses a lever and winch to pull a door off, which is something I don't know that I would have figured out.
Right. And then even Freddy, who, we see him die and turn, and he's just like right back where he was, except now he wants brains. He's just fully talking. He's blinded, but can still like grope and find a ladder and climb it.
Yeah. What do you think about how this film starts? It starts off with this text.
Title.
It says, the events portrayed in this film are all true. The names are real. The names are real names of real people and real organizations. And
I think it's hilarious.
It's hilarious. It's written like a child would have written it.
Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah, and
it's so good.
And it also links right up to part of the plot, which is that the events of Night of the Living Dead are real and happened, but were covered up by the government, and they had to tell the story wrong because there was going to be a lawsuit, which is pretty funny because there is a lawsuit at the root of this film. Not a full lawsuit, but there's a legal disagreement.
Yes.
Yeah, and you may know a little bit more about this, but I'll give it a go. So, 1968, Night of the Living Dead's called Night of the Flesh Eaters. And it goes basically all the way to the final cut with that title, and they change the name to Night of the Living Dead at the very end. And nobody bothers to register the copyright for that. And so there is no copyright for the title of Night of the Living Dead because the copyright law doesn't change until 1976. Do you want to pick it up?
Yeah, and then Night of the Living Dead was the vision of George Romero and John Russo. I assume his name is pronounced. And after Night of the Living Dead, they part ways, and George Romero takes Of the Dead.
Yeah, that's
and Russo takes The Living Dead.
Yeah, and so we literally mean like Romero got quotation Of the Dead quotation, and the other guy got quotation Living Dead quotation, and so they both treat Night of the Living Dead though as the breaking off point, except for Return of the Living Dead just goes, that shit didn't happen like that, and then goes off into completely zany territory.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways more original territory, although the Romero tack is more copied, because I think it lends itself more to sequels. Because I think that one of the things that bothered me about Return of the Living Dead when I was a little kid was like, there's no way out. There's no way to win. All you can do is contain these zombies.
This is the apocalypse.
Yeah, it's the full-on apocalypse, and I'll just jump to the end real quick. It ends in a nuclear war, basically, or at least a nuclear strike, which will have spread the zombie disease everywhere.
Even worse.
Yeah, 2,4,5 trioxin is now everywhere,
which they developed to spray on marijuana or something.
Yeah. I mean, that line to me was just one of the funniest. And I was like, man, there has to be at least one strain out there called trioxin, and I just couldn't find one. And if I was a weed grower, I would for sure be making a strain called trioxin.
Yeah. So I just want to talk about Linnea quickly. Let's
talk
jump straight to her.
Yeah.
I think part of what's good about this movie, I was saying, we were talking about how these characters had depth, and there are all these like little things in the film, whether in the foreground or the background, that showed a lot of care. And I think one of those things is that not all the actors, but a lot of them are like really solid or interesting. And that's all I ask.
Yeah.
Good or interesting.
Right.
I think it's really easy to sort of go like, oh, she was the one who danced naked on the crypt, on the tombstone. Right. But like, she's actually really good in this movie. Like, she's really engaged, really interesting. All of her lines are super memorable. I mean, she takes a line like, oh, let's do that. And she just says it where suddenly the whole scene revolves around her declaration of what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And then, it's no small thing that 1985, a movie of this caliber would be the word, I guess, her dancing shaved completely naked in a graveyard. Like, that's pretty daring. And I think I'm not especially interested in the whole Scream Queens phenomenon. I think Scream Queens generally revolve around a lot of horror movies that I'm just completely disengaged from.
Yeah.
But I think she really deserves to be remembered well for what a great job she did in this movie.
Oh, yeah. I mean, she's really just fun to look at. She's got great body. She's dancing around. Her dancing is super funny.
She's fully committed.
Yeah. I mean, in all of her lines, you ever wonder what it would like to just be killed, or like how, all this stuff. It's like,
and again, spiders, like, try not to think about dying too much.
Yeah. But it's funny because like now, I mean, how many like alt punk girls or whatever are just like have like death tattoos from Sandman or something like that, and so it's like, okay, you guys are
Suicide Girls.
Yeah,
just the name.
Suicide Girls, right? Yeah. I mean, so you're there. You have like this person who's really, really for real into all this crazy shit, to the point of like dancing in a graveyard and all this stuff, and it's just fun. And then all the older actors in the film, like the army guy and his wife, the guy that's on the base in California, and then Clu Gulager, I guess, he plays Burt Wilson, and then Don Calfa, who is awesome, he plays Ernie. They are legit old school Hollywood character actors, and what the type of actor they are is not that much in Hollywood anymore. And if it is, it's weirdly celebrated because it's like, oh, you're like such a cool character actor, like somebody like J.K. Simmons in Whiplash or something like that. He's the dad in Juno.
I tried to block Juno out.
Oh, okay, well, Mark has blocked Juno out, but everybody else watching this will know this supremely jacked older man who's just a phenomenal actor. But like guys like that, or the guys that played like Fredo in The Godfather, like those like just really memorable, clearly, like they probably did a lot of stage acting or something like that. They're just real actors, probably like got their SAG card in like 1920 or something like that.
Right.
But those guys, when they're in these like kind of zany 80s films, give the films weight, which they probably wouldn't have now.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. Interesting bringing up the general or whatever the fuck he is. I always approach these movies thinking about Yara's clamshell e-reader, like what is the thing that doesn't belong. And this is a comedy and it's pretty low budget, so it's full of non sequiturs. So it's a little unfair. But I will say that the absolute basic premise of this film is pretty weak. And it's you kind of can't explain it away through comedy or low budget. That the army delivered these canisters, but nobody bothered to call that number on it for what reason is completely...
Well, I thought about this too.
I've got more, but if you got an answer to
even, just so you know, I thought about this. I'm very curious to see where you're leading this one, because I have thoughts about this too. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you though.
Oh no, well no. If you can solve the first half.
Okay, so the reason why they showed up at their place.
Well, typical army fuck up.
Typical army fuck up.
But why are they still there?
Right. So, but later on, the guy who owns the joint says something like, "Oh, if people find out we had these, that chemical company is going to get on my ass." And then you get the feeling that somebody just was negligent.
Right.
And time passed, and too much time passed, and somebody thought someone else was going to take care of it, and it never happened, and now nobody wants to get caught.
Right. Okay, so, I'll buy that.
I'm not,
Yeah. But then we've got this general or whatever the fuck. Not good with military uniforms. But 14 years later, he's still like... can't even have a peaceable dinner with his wife because he's so stressed out about God damn it, I don't know where they are. Like 14 years later, he still can't digest a meal properly because he's so worked up over these canisters. That's a little weak.
Yeah, I mean,
they could have fixed. It didn't need to be that silly.
Yeah, well, I thought about this too. Because this film will trap you if you try to start looking to explain things. It is not perhaps the best film to dig super deep into, but I did, for whatever reason, think a lot about the same thing, which is like, okay, what's the basically underlying plot here? Is that there was a marijuana-related chemical accident. I mean, for real, that's kind of what they imply.
Aren't they all?
Yeah, they all are. So which made me really think about the beginning of Pineapple Express. Like, in the very beginning of Pineapple Express, there's the black and white. They're working on.
Remind our listeners and me.
Oh, it's the very beginning, so you must have gotten started on whatever you were doing early.
But
in the very beginning of Pineapple Express, there's this black and white scene with Bill Hader, and Bill Hader is in a room, and they're giving him weed to smoke, and he's like making jazz drummer noises and going crazy. And then there's a general who's like, "Shut it down!" So I was just thinking, like, wouldn't it be fun if Pineapple Express and Return of the Living Dead were in the same universe.
But
they're not, though, because of the way Return of the Living Dead ends, obviously.
Because it's a true story where everyone died.
Yeah, but I'm always... I have this like really terrible postmodern habit of trying to jam things into shared universes just to excuse bullshit failure of plot. I don't know why I do it.
Well, speaking of postmodern and films, I mean, it's kind of hard to rationalize away a low-budget horror comedy. I mean, like, I would love to cover Scream and Cabin in the Woods at some point, but what I think is really hard to think critically about horror comedies is that they've already done the work.
Yes.
The way I tend to think about horror films, if I watch Scream is already doing that work for me.
Right.
The way I think about horror movies is Cabin in the Woods.
Yeah.
And that slightly applies to Return of the Living Dead. Like, it's very meta. It goes straight to Night of the Living Dead, like right up front, and goes like, this is true. It just completely dismantles itself with the opening title card.
Even like the opening encounter with a living dead creature, they're like, get in the brain, and they go all this trouble, and they like smash through the brain with a pickaxe. And Freddy's response after they say it's not working, he's like, you mean the movie lied? Which I think is such a great, just like, if you were the wrong kind of person, you could write like 40 pages on Baudrillard in that statement. You could just really just get in there. And no one, please do that. Please, no one. It would be terrible. I might do that.
You could easily have been that person had you not done your thesis on
Terminator. Yeah. I did a honors thesis for my undergrad that was about the Terminator film franchise and men's movements called Iron John Connor. I received an A, and if you're listening out there, Professor Carrico, thank you for not giving me an F, which I deserve. But okay, so they spray some shit on some weed, and it goes bad, and then zombies happen, probably at least in the area where they happen in the film. So, as per the canon of Return of the Living Dead, that stuff was all a lie, but you assume that there was probably at least a graveyard full of these canister zombies put away someplace, especially since none of them could be killed. They probably didn't have a mobile incinerator. And if they had incinerated them, it would have just created the situation earlier. The situation where the ashes spread and cause more undead outbreaks. So they keep bringing it back to failure of the government. And you think about like this guy, this general sitting there, he's for 14 years realizes that there's something that could just end the planet. I feel like maybe that justifies his stress. Maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. That's a long way of saying it. But maybe not. I don't know.
Someone had a good point online that I read where if a nuclear explosion happened over that area, that there wouldn't be ash spreading a chemical. All of the chemicals there would just be incinerated. Like actually the idea, it's one thing to blow something up or burn it and spread it, but a nuclear explosion would just nullify everything within its blast radius. It would have totally worked, which maybe it did, and that's why there was 2, 3, 4 Rave to the Grave. There might have you seen the other ones?
I've seen Return of the Living Dead 3,
which is I really like that one.
Yeah, it's the best of the sequels.
Yes.
I've heard that the second one is not worth seeing at all.
I skimmed through 5 when I was culling footage for Pentagram Sam, which y'all can just Google Pentagram Sam. I'm not going to explain that. So let's talk about collective dread. Just what, if we think about horror movies as always being a reference to some sort of collective anxiety in our culture or the culture in which it was made, does this actually have that? Because Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead are just like the most fucking heavy-handed messaged. Well, the first one wasn't quite as heavy-handed, but Day and Dawn are burdened by how statement heavy they were. Did you feel this one was?
Well, I think there are 3 things that I picked up on that were anxieties that would have been anxieties at the time. Well, 2 that were anxieties at the time, and 1 that's just kind of an eternal one. The eternal one is the punks are young and hot, and there's these concerns over being like old and dying and having old people eat you and all this stuff. So And there's really a pretty major generational gap between the older guys that own the facility and the young punks. And they're kind of just both in it together with this threat of this horde of whatever attacking them. Then there's the nuclear threat, which was what I was terrified of in the 80s. My grandmother, who I lived with for a long time, had the 700 Club on 24/7, and it was always about like how Jesus is going to ride in and save us from nuclear winter. But nuclear winter was always coming. And so my first real major fear as a child was nuclear war. I was fucking terrified of it. And you get movies like that Gutenberg film, The Day After, that they make everybody watch in high school in the 80s. And we still had to do duck and cover drills when I was a small child. Then you have, Star Wars, which even as a small child felt absurd. Reagan's Star Wars, not the George Lucas epic. So to me, I was always aware of that, and then the fact that this movie ends like that was I think just a bummer to me when I was a kid. I was like, this sucks. And then when the rain is coming on them, they're like yelling about acid rain, and acid rain was pretty much an issue in every single early 80s urban movie. Like there's a scene in, I think, Escape from New York where they're like avoiding acid rain or something like that. And then acid rain, who knows how many movies that caused mutants, and probably dozens. Yeah. So what about you? Any anxieties that you picked up?
The same. I mean, I guess I think it's interesting that it sort of starts off. I mean, it's a zombie movie. There's no matter how ignorant you make yourself before you start a book or a movie, there's some things you cannot avoid knowing.
Right.
And the thing that you can't avoid knowing is that this is a zombie horror movie going in. But it starts off with punks who are, at least in mainstream media in 1985, sowers of chaos. They are the villains in everything.
Yep.
Then the next thing you know, they are not the problem at all.
Not at all. Yeah. It's interesting too, because by the time I was into punk rock music, like listening to it, going to shows, it was pretty well in the mainstream. I mean, Green Day's already on MTV at that point. Probably I had started off with heavy metal, which because of the satanic panic in the 80s was difficult to be a fan of if you were in certain places in the South. And I was definitely in a spot where it was not what my friends were doing, listening to heavy metal. But punk rock was different. Like when it finally came to Louisiana in a way, at least enough for me to recognize it, it was pretty mainstream. And so I never thought of punks as villains. It always seemed pretty ridiculous to me. Although I just read Harley Flanagan from the Cro-Mags book, his Hardcore Life. It was crazy. Like if you were in the Lower East Side, it was basically you get the case for making punk rockers villains in movies.
Yeah. Well, let's do some of our typical touchstones. Talk about rules of engagement.
Yeah. So, I mean, this movie completely upends everything that you would normally use to fight a zombie.
Yeah. It's just hopeless.
It's just hopeless.
Which I think overlaps with us talking about methods of vanquishment, is that there is neither. There are no rules of engagement here, and there's no method of vanquishment here. There's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what? Yeah. What would Chad do if you were in control of this situation and knew the outcome? Is there a way to stop it?
Well, the answer here is clearly 50 cal machine guns.
Just don't burn them. Just level them.
Just obliterate them until you have and then once there's just a bunch of pieces, you just throw them in sacks, bury them in the ground, call it a day. I feel like that would be the way to handle this.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, but you would have to have, probably what Max Brooks writes about in World War Z, which is this square shaped assault pattern where you just shoot into the middle and then move the square tighter and tighter and tighter until there's nothing left.
Yeah.
That would probably be the way to go. But you would have to be, the fact that they're sort of intelligent makes it a little more complicated, because they're doing tricks. They're setting an ambush for police officers and, no one's expecting that sort of thing. And then they're using their invulnerability to overrun lines. So you would have to have, you could push it back. If you had tall walls that they couldn't get around or whatever, I think you could do something. But There's kind of the Ice 9 quality of it, like from Cat's Cradle, where there's a little piece of chip of, Ice 9 that if it touches water, it'll turn everything to ice. You're like, okay, well, what happens if it touches a lake that touches an ocean that touches everything? Well, it destroys everything. So that's kind of what goes on in this. So the real problem is like containment. Like that's all you can ever do is like try to contain this threat. And eventually the threat's not going to be containable.
Yeah.
But,
Go ahead.
I mean, yeah, that's all I have.
Oh, no. I mean, speaking of Max Brooks, I think that we were talking earlier about the running zombie, and really nothing happened with zombies that sort of upped the ante in any way post Return of the Living Dead until the movie of World War Z. And I never want to say anything positive about that movie. The book is incredible. I love that book. And I think Max Brooks is a super fascinating individual. But that movie is just utter shit. But it introduces the Swarm, which really ups the ante something else. And obviously says a lot about things like globalization. And it's, it's this very potentially politicized way of envisioning zombies in a new way that it's not like zombies weren't used for discussions about immigration before, but the idea of the Swarm really changes the terrain, and that's definitely about there's nothing you can do but contain it as well.
Yeah. Interesting too is that Romero's sequels had already come out by this point.
Yes.
And I think played within a month.
Day of the Dead and Return of the Living Dead were really close. I don't remember how close.
I think it was pretty close enough to like basically compare their box offices. And
yes,
yeah. So Romero's movie was just flat. It didn't make any money at all. Whereas this movie, it cost like $4 million to make. It earned like 13 or something like that at the box office pretty early on, which is at the time fairly successful.
Yeah.
And really made a statement about. It's very odd that this movie would have been more successful than Romero's movies, but Romero's zombie canon is what kind of continued on, because the zombies from Walking Dead behave the same as the original Romero zombies do. There's no difference at all. So that legacy, for whatever came on, and I think honestly, like that style of zombie does let you tell a little bit more of a human story for the reasons what we talked about earlier. Is like it gives humans time to get at each other.
Well, yeah, usually zombie movies are about the realization that we are the monsters. Yeah. And yeah, if the zombie moves slow, you can explore what that is at leisure.
Yeah. I have another note that I wrote down here, which is like this movie is just basically Scooby-Doo. And
holy shit.
Yeah, like because they're like the whole crew, and I haven't done the work of like linking up who would be who in the crew. But there is totally like a Scooby-Doo quality to all of this. And, with the, although there aren't any like bad villains that you would rip the mask off of, there's like in this movie, the villainy is basically military incompetence and government incompetence, which is kind of a thing of the 80s. Like there's a lot of movies where like the government fucking up is the thing. Yeah. And even in Repo Man, there's that going on in the background a little bit when they're looking for the alien truck and they don't find it. And this film and Repo Man both have the older character actors, like Harry Dean Stanton in Repo Man, just crushing it. And it's there's something really fun about these young punks next to these old characters. It's almost like what happens in Gran Torino. It's like what's fun about Gran Torino is that like Clint Eastwood's old man character and this young Hmong kid, right. And that's fun. And it made me want. Like I wish there was that dynamic in The Walking Dead, kind of,
There's a lot of things I wish.
Yeah,
we'll cover that in a future episode.
One day we're purposely avoiding The Walking Dead here, just because it's just such a big thing to talk about. I mean, let's talk about the soundtrack.
I'd love to.
Yeah, I mean, because this movie, there are really great, interesting synth sounds, music in the soundtrack, but it's not mostly that. There's actually hardly any of that in it.
Yeah, it's mostly like punk, new wave, goth bands.
Yeah.
Obviously, by 1985, there had been lots of amazing scores, but there hadn't been that many good soundtracks.
Right.
And I think that's another big feather in the cap of this movie is that I mean, I really tried to think about it, and maybe I'm just not thinking of any good examples, but pre-1985, how many movies can you think of that had a soundtrack that is worth listening to from beginning to end? Mm-hmm. Or, you know, you could maybe excise one or two songs, but like Fast Times at Ridgemont High? Valley Girl, maybe?
Even then, like, I mean, this is a...
what else?
Like, this is a punk soundtrack.
Yeah.
Like, the only other movie...
Well, it's both good and it's true to form.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, these characters listen to the soundtrack.
Right.
Even though it's not them always listening to these songs. These songs are often just, like, flown
in the
in.
background, yeah.
The damn TSOL, Flesh Eaters. Like, yeah, this movie's supposed to take place in Louisville. It's clearly taking place in LA, but a bunch of LA punks,
right.
This was their soundtrack.
Yeah. And Repo Man was before this, right?
It was. That was a pretty good soundtrack.
So, yeah, the Repo Man.
Not as good, but pretty damn solid.
The Repo Man soundtrack was the first soundtrack that I ever heard spoken about as like a thing. It was the first soundtrack that when people were like, oh, have you heard the Repo Man soundtrack? Because, you know, when I was really little, I liked that movie Highlander, and Queen did the soundtrack for it, right?
Yes.
So I
just watched Highlander 2, The Quakening last week.
Man, is it a turd.
Holy
it is
shit.
Just a movie that does not make any sense. It looked like that movie says cocaine and producer notes. Oh my God. That's just what that movie means to me.
Oh, Argentina, what have you done?
Yeah, that is...
Okay.
Yeah, anyway. But... Sorry. But it's kind of funny, like the Queen soundtrack for Highlander is really more like what's going on now, where like one band will do the whole soundtrack, right. Which is an interesting kind of return. And then having good music in the soundtrack as part of the film, I think Tarantino really brought that back. Mm-hmm. You know, like his music choices. I mean, he completely resurrected surf guitar, really. I mean, like, I guess you could, there's some Dick Dale fan club out there that's going to be furious.
They're so pissed at you right now.
But come on.
Yeah.
Most people until that scene in Pulp Fiction had completely discounted surf guitar. I mean, maybe they came back and watched this movie and saw The Surfing Dead and were like, oh, this is great. But that's not worth worrying about, I don't think. But yeah, so Repo Man soundtrack, this soundtrack, it really like stands on its own. It's also, I couldn't find it on Spotify, which is interesting.
Well, there were some weird legal things, like the damned song on the soundtrack is not on any of the video versions. It was in the original, and it's on the soundtrack released, but there was some legal nonsense so that any DVD or Blu-ray version doesn't have the damned in it in the movie. I don't know why it wouldn't be on Spotify. You know, oftentimes soundtracks are tricky, and speaking of Repo Man, I recently wanted the Iggy Pop theme song to Repo Man, and you can't buy it. It's not available online. What you can buy is Iggy Pop Repo Man (parentheses demo version). I cannot hear. It's probably zero crossing nullifies the original. It's probably the exact same recording, but you can't buy the Repo Man theme song on iTunes or anywhere online. Huh. And it's probably, again, that legal thing where, like, it's just such a pyramid of legal nonsense that nobody's willing to untangle just for, you know, nobody buys music online anymore, so why bother?
Yeah, and it's not like the 20 people looking for this soundtrack are going to make a stink over it, you know.
Exactly.
Like, oh, I can't get it on iTunes.
Right.
You probably own it on cassette anyway, you know, or whatever. Special effects, what do you think about the special effects in this film compared to some of the other zombie films?
Really inconsistent, but in an interesting way. Like, Tarman is rad, but it has nothing to do with trash as a zombie, which looks terrible. And then the iconic scene of the zombie shoving its head up in front, you know, opening its mouth and do you want a party?
Eyeballs.
And it has eyeballs, and you can see the strings lowering its jaw. It's pretty inconsistent, but like, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of really fun ideas, and it gets into that kind of like Gremlins thing where like a lot of the special effects serve to make gags happen.
Yeah.
So there's a Looney Tunes quality to a lot of the stuff in the film. I mean, like
the pickaxe in the head.
And
the jaws are still going.
Yeah, that's ludicrous. The halved dogs that suddenly come back to life, which I always remember thinking was really sad for some reason. Because I was like, these dogs are never going to be able to get brains, so they're always going to be sad and in pain. I don't know. I just am soft.
I think the first Tarman head gets knocked off. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Just that gesture is very slapstick and funny.
Oh, totally. I mean, then people are like slipping and falling, and then the way the Undertaker just breaks his foot out of nowhere. Like just nothing.
I actually
happens.
rewinded that. Dude, take two.
It's like he stands there and just decides that his foot is broken. He's like, ah! I mean, so there's that. And then there's all kinds of, I mean, you could just go to town with things that don't make sense. Like, why didn't Tarman eat them initially? If he pops out of there and he's super hungry, and there's two bodies laid on the ground, I don't know. I mean, could be he was just very excited to get out and just ran off.
Yeah.
The director of this film,
Dan
O'Bannon, a great filmmaker, made a bunch of really rad horror movies, very steeped in the Lovecraft tradition, wrote Alien, which is pretty badass. And I didn't know this until recently. I had never really been a person who looked at directors very much. Being a writer, I always looked at who wrote the screenplay or especially what book the movie was based on. That's always been kind of the most important to me. And then just because I'm a kind of just a regular ass person, the acting and special effects make a big impact on me. But, looking at this director, he was part of Alejandro Jodorowsky's crew, working on Dune. He was the special effects supervisor. And then that project actually basically drove him to almost homeless. And he picked up Alien as a gig to basically get back on his feet after Jodorowsky ruined him, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And then he picks back up and makes this. But you see the influence of Jodorowsky in Alien, especially with H.R. Giger.
Yeah.
You don't really see it in this film at all, I would say, except for maybe the madcap elements of it. I don't know. I mean, do you see the fingerprints of any other film director in this film? How some of it, some of our earlier podcasts have talked about the Kubrickian influence on this film, but I don't know. Are there any directors that you would lay this on?
No, and this movie's obviously not without precedent, but it's really unique in so many ways.
Yeah. They're just fun, weird little decisions and beats in the movie too. The Undertaker's pants get torn, and there's a moment where he just takes an actor moment and just cuts the frayed ends of his pants off. And it's just such a
While
weird...
he's deciding what he's going to tax his friends for using his crematorium.
Yeah, and then later on when Ernie has turned, instead of going after brains, he just puts his wedding ring on the crematorium switch, just gets in there and sets himself on fire just because I guess he's that swell of a guy. It's just interesting.
To a great Roky Erickson song.
Yeah, it's just so weird. It's like a really... the soundtrack in that scene is better than it should be. There's just so many elements in this film that are just better than they should be.
Yeah.
And they just work really well.
Also, just when they're at the window and they see the cop pull up, or the second ambulance pull up, and they're just like, no.
Yeah, they just they give up.
There's nothing they can do.
This movie also, Black Dude makes it pretty far to the end. Kind of an interesting thing for a horror movie at this time.
Absolutely.
I was actually expecting him to die first,
sure.
As is the way of horror films.
Yes.
So expertly pointed out by the Scream franchise. Some firsts for this movie. Definitely the first zombie little person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shoots off the legs. Yeah. Keeps coming.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't see that very often. It's the first time the zombies go explicitly for brains.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting that stayed in, every time you see a t-shirt with a zombie on it, it says brains. Yep. And the reason for it, makes the pain go away. So you're like, okay, are your brains like a drug for zombies? They're trying to nullify their sad existence.
I have a feeling that that's one of those Russo maybe, or whoever came up with that. It's such a good idea that the why of it just is not worth pursuing. Like, how does that work? It doesn't matter. They eat brains, makes the pain go away. Screen gold. Let's keep going.
Yeah, and it definitely leads to some really great special effects. Like, there's some really good ooey gooey brain stuff going on. Back to the punk rock thing. Like, one of the best lines in the movie is when Suicide's just like standing there and he has like kind of his Hamlet moment where he's like giving his like sort of like punk rock soliloquy.
You think this is a fucking costume?
Yeah. It's like, do you think this is a costume? This is a way of life. And to me, I feel like I heard people say that shit for real.
Oh, I probably did.
Yeah. I mean, and it just seems pretty hilarious.
Yeah. Oh, but when I saw that, I think I fully identified with him. I mean, I did not look like that, but like he said that and I was like, yeah.
Yeah. Which is the punk rocker that has the trench coat on and the mohawk?
Is it Scuzz?
Yeah. It has a Star Trek communicator badge tucked in there with the rest of his buttons and stuff like that. Just fun stuff to notice.
Actually, one thing I will say is that what's her name? The party girl in the blue dress. What's her name?
I don't know. I'll never know.
It says Casey. What?
I mean, it could be.
Okay,
it seems weird that she wouldn't have a name like Rocket or...
Yeah, like everybody has such a badass name in this movie, but I guess her name was Casey in the movie. Anyway, something that has always bothered me is her hair. Mm-hmm. She totally has the like... This actress got a job playing... although her character is not a punk, mm-hmm. her hair is clearly done mohawk-like, mm-hmm. and her hair is clearly styled in the way of when an actor or an actress gets a part playing a certain type of character, but they don't want to actually do anything to their hair to commit to the part. Mm-hmm. So her hair is just like basic female medium-length hair, shellacked upright and sprayed blue. Mm-hmm. And I call bullshit on that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, at least Suicide was committed to that weird X on the back of his head.
Right?
Like shaved in.
Seriously. And at least Quigley wore a wig.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the most epic wigs of all time. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have much else to say. This is just a fun movie that is worth watching. Yeah. If you haven't seen it in a while. I mean, it's fun. It's definitely a weed movie. Don't look too hard for it to make sense.
No.
I would say.
It's sort of like having a favorite band and trying to pick apart the ways in which they're actually good. I feel it's a little difficult for me, but I do feel like its legacy is pretty interesting. There's so much that came after it that it's hard to imagine how it could have made its way, whether it's Scream or Cabin in the Woods or any zombie movie after, whether they were fast or slow, doesn't matter. Yeah. This movie really cut into the history of horror cinema.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about this is watching the movie now when the different like punk rock songs kick in and they're like beloved songs. They're like songs that are now classics. The film has a little bit of the feel of like a Guardians of the Galaxy because you're watching a movie, but there's like classic songs like kind of popping off and during these fun, exciting moments in the film. Right. And I wonder like how that must have felt for that music to be contemporary at the time, and not just contemporary, but underground. I mean, the mainstream film goer is not going to be familiar with like 45 Grave,
right,
or probably any of that other stuff.
Well, I think that was part of the excitement for me at the time, and it's not like I remember every moment of that movie from the first time I saw it. Yeah. But like sitting there in the theater and going like, "What the hell is this song? Oh my God, what the hell is this song?" And just kind of like, I mean, when's the last time you saw a film where you did not know any of the music in, not the score, but the soundtrack, and you were just constantly like, holy shit, this is an amazing track perfectly put into this movie.
Yeah.
It's hard.
I mean, when's the last time you were introduced to new music because of a film? Like, I mean, I can't, maybe...
Yeah. It's rare.
Maybe Stranger Things, the band that did the soundtrack for that. I had not heard of them before that. Survive?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had not heard of them before that, but they were clearly popular before that.
Right.
And definitely not like an ensemble soundtrack either. Just a bunch of bands. I mean, it would be fun to put together a horror movie with a soundtrack of that caliber now. You know, who do you think you would look to put on a soundtrack now?
Of like contemporary bands?
Yeah, say we made a zombie movie.
Yeah.
Boom. Like I directed it and wrote it or whatever, and you were in charge of putting music in it.
Okay.
And it's a zany horror movie, but it takes place now. And you got to use like within the last 5 years. Music.
Okay, Cold Cave, Drab Majesty, In Halt.
You know this is a fun movie, right?
Pass. I don't know any fun music.
I don't have any answers.
Okay.
Yeah, I basically just listen to Iron Maiden and Rancid all the time. So
Rancid?
Yeah, I love that band.
Oh dear.
I live in Oakland now too, the homeland.
Fuck, I was just watching Operation Ivy videos on YouTube last night.
You try to get your black bloc on, you're getting fired up.
Milo's coming back. I gotta get fired up.
Yeah, you know, like it's funny, like thinking about like remakes and when movies come back and are like another thing. My favorite album of last year was from this band called The Interrupters, and if they're on Hellcat, like which is Rancid's label, and if you had told me that was just a band from 1993 that I happened to have missed, I would have believed you. I mean, it's such a throwback to that thing, and you know, it's like music is doing that right now. Films seem to be doing that for sure. You know, it's like the wave of nostalgia has overtaken us.
Just a little too much.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right, to be continued. Let's fade to black and roll the credits.
All right. Don't forget to give us all the ratings and honors we truly deserve on iTunes. Thank you.
And we will see you. You'll be hearing us next time for Phantasm.
Phantasm, boy.